Hello and thank you all for joining. I'm Jo and I work in the High Needs Funding team. So today I'll be taking you through the import-export data error notification process. So thank you for coming to this local authority workshop on the import-export data error notification process. As I said, all videos and audios have been switched to off. And please, can you ensure that they're off? This session is being recorded and we will send a link out to you in a few days when it's available. So we have quite a lot to cover today, including what is the import-export adjustment, why we have the data error notification process, actually reviewing the data, the evidence that's required to make a funding change, how to complete the template, and the timings for this process. There'll also be time at the end for questions, although this part of the session won't be recorded. Please can you hold any questions to the end, as hopefully we will have covered most of these by the end of the presentation. At the end, if you can pop these in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. And I hope you find this session useful. And on to the next slide. So to start off with, what is the import-export adjustment? Now, this is explained in the guidance sent out last week, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but very briefly, most high needs funding within the DSG is allocated to local authorities based on the children and young people living in their area, regardless of where they're educated. However, we do know that local authorities can face higher costs, for example, place funding, if more pupils and students living outside of their local authority area are attending schools and colleges in their area, for which they're the provider local authority. Whereas those local authorities with a large number of pupils and students living in their area or attending schools and colleges in other local authorities are going to face lower costs. So the import-export adjustment provides some compensation for those differences in costs resulting from commissioning decisions of other local authorities. As DFE funds some providers, for example, non-maintained special schools and special post-16 institutions, it's also considered as a local authority for the purpose of the import-export adjustment. And on to the next slide. So the data used to calculate the import-export adjustment in the DSG is the same as previous years. This is also set out in the guidance that was issued last week. It's based on the January 2025 school census for schools and the 24 to 25 ILR R06 for post-16 providers. And the next slide. So why do we actually have the data error process? Unfortunately, we do know that schools and colleges can make mistakes in the census or ILR returns. And in some cases, these may actually have a significant impact on the local authority's funding. For example, if a college in my local authority area has 150 high needs students, but forgot to record these as in receipt of top up on their R06 return, or actually didn't submit the return in error, if 100 of those 150 students lived in other local authorities, my local authority's DSG could be £600,000 down due to that error. This process is therefore intended for cases where there are significant errors, and we make school and college level data available to local authorities to help with this. However, there's no requirement on local authorities to submit a return, and neither do we expect local authorities to review the data at individual school and college level. Although we do expect local authorities to cooperate where a possible error is identified. It should also be noted that this process is only for errors in the import-export data, that is, the actual school census or college ILR, that actually results in a financial impact on the local authority. It's not intended for in-year changes or where the data differs to the high needs places funded or the local authority funding top-up. And this is explained more in the guidance. And now on to the next slide about reviewing the data. So the import-export adjustment data was sent to local authorities last week. As mentioned, the school and college level data is made available to assist local authorities. Some have told us the data error process can take a lot of time and resource. However, as I've said, there's no requirement for local authorities to review all the data, and it's not actually intended to be used as an audit or reviewed in detail. So this slide shows our recommended steps involved in this process, and I'll now show some example data that's similar to that sent to local authorities last week and how you can choose to review it. Now on to the next slide. So the adjustment summary sheet in the import-export data that was sent out to local authorities last week shows the final total import-export adjustment amount for your local authority. So in this slide, we have a local authority with a total net adjustment of minus £216,000, as shown in the summary table at the top. Now this is calculated based on the 2,433 total high needs pupils attending schools and colleges in that local authority area. These are known as imports minus the 2,469 total high needs pupils and students living in that local authority area. And these are known as imports and shown in the total exports data in the column on the left. This gives a net total of minus 36 pupils and students. This is then times by £6,000 per pupil, hence the minus £216,000 adjustment. And this means the local authority is considered a net exporter. If you were the local authority receiving this data, you may feel that this is reasonable. For example, it's similar to last year's, or there's an expected difference due to new or closing providers, or it reflects the general trends. If so, you may decide not to consider the data further. Alternative, if you're unsure, you may want to see the reason for that level of the adjustment and consider the breakdown by provider type. So for example, here we can see the total mainstream schools have more high needs pupils attending schools in their area under the imports, which shows 1,090, than those living in the local authority area. So the exports show 1,070, which gives a net change of plus 20. Whereas those in FE institutions are much higher for those attending outside the local authority area, which gives a net of minus 56 because you have the 250 imports less the 306 in the exports column. Hence, overall, the local authority here is considered an exporting local authority with that negative net total funding adjustment. If you are concerned about the adjustment not being as expected, the provider type can help to inform whether there may be an error. For example, it may be here that they hadn't considered the special post-16 institutions or non-maintained special schools, or if they're actually funding 400 places at colleges in their area, the 249.5 FE imports could suggest that there's actually an error. This is why we make the school and college level data available, and it can help in such cases. That's quite a lot of information, so I'm going to pause here for a few seconds. Okay, and on to the next slide. So first of all, we're looking at the export sheet in the data. So this sheet includes data for all those high needs pupils and students that live in your local authority area. The first few rows in the top table are the same as those in the summary sheet earlier. At row 11, you can filter by institution type or for a specific provider. The local authority columns from F onwards show the provider local authority for that school or college and the number of high needs pupils or students living in your local authority area attending that provider. So in here, I filtered for mainstream schools. There are only actually 5 schools shown in here, but there can be well over 100 in the local authorities data. That's far too many to fit onto this slide, hence we don't expect you to review all this data line by line. This is also why the actual total row is higher, because the total here doesn't include all of the mainstream schools. So for mainstream schools in particular, may find it easier to actually look at the totals and see if they seem reasonable, or apply a threshold if you're considering possible areas by specific schools. For example, on the first row here, you can see there's a pupil living in this local authority attending a primary school in other LA3. It may be that the local authority looking at this data doesn't recall providing top-up funding to that school. However, it's important to remember that this data does relate to pupils living in the local authority at the time of the census. And there may be cases where another local authority was actually funding the top-up at that time. For example, if a pupil recently moved. And such cases wouldn't be considered data errors, as the pupil was actually living in the local authority at the time. So the census data itself is correct. Again, I'm just going to pause for a few seconds before moving on to the next slide. And now onto the imports. So here we have the import sheet. It does look very similar to the export sheet, but here it lists all the schools and colleges that are actually in your local authority area. And the local authority columns show those local authorities where the pupil and students actually live. So here I filtered on the FE institutions, and you can see there's one college in this local authority, and 200 of the 250 students attending the college also live in the local authority's area. In the summary sheet earlier, you may recall that I mentioned the local authority's concerns as it's funding 400 high needs places at college. While there's likely to be some variance between the ILR data and places funded, the difference here between the 250 high needs students and the 400 places funded is clearly quite large. And this is where the school or college level data can be helpful in identifying possible errors. It may be that there's only one college in the local authority area, so the local authority can contact this college with the ILR data to check that discrepancy in case there has been an error. Or it may even be that the school has 2 colleges in the area and that the data for this college seems reasonable, but the local authority can look further into the reason for that missing college. So now the data's been reviewed, we'll go on to the next stage, which is about contacting providers and local authorities for evidence of an error. On to the next slide. So if a potential census or ILR data is identified, and you may want to submit a template, you'll first need to contact the relevant provider and local authority for the required evidence. In doing so, it's important to engage with the provider and local authority early. In some cases, you may need to contact the provider for the correct information before going out to local authorities. So allow them time to reply that will also enable you to contact the local authority before the 4th of July. It's also important that your request is clear about the actual information you need and when by. So for example, to providers, you'll need confirmation of the error and the corrected data at the time of the ILR or census. To local authorities, you'll need their agreement to the data error and to the funding change. Also keep it simple. This avoids the risk of errors and any confusion. For local authorities, you'll need their agreement to the total net change. So if there are several providers, using a tables with the overall total in a single email thread is much easier to follow than seven several separate email threads. And although it may seem obvious, finally putting yourself in the position of the recipient. From the request, would you understand what's actually needed and why? Also, as it's possible the request may actually be needed as evidence, if you were the DFE, would it meet those requirements? On to the next slide. So the type of evidence will actually differ depending on whether a case is submitted as agreed with the local authority, not agreed, in which case we'll need evidence from both the provider and local authority, or whether it's DFE funded, in which case only evidence from the provider is needed. In all cases, however, the evidence must clearly show an error in the census or ILR data used in the import-export adjustment, and that it results in a funding change to a local authority's DSG and the implications of that change. And on to the next slide. So here's a checklist that you may find helpful, and it's the things that we look for when considering requests and reviewing the evidence provided. So firstly, the correspondence needs to be with the correct local authority and provider. And then, as shown in the second and third rows, all emails with local authorities need to clearly relate to the import-export data error process and set out the net funding change and funding implications on the local authority's DSG. On the fourth row, where this is clearly agreed with the local authority and the previous checks have been met, this is sufficient and can be an agreed change on the template. Where it isn't clearly agreed with the local authority or no reply is received, this would then be considered a not agreed change in the template, and the initial communication must have been agreed before, or must have been sent before the 4th of July, and that's shown at row 5. For both not agreed and DFE funded changes, evidence of communication with the provider, shown at row 6 and 7, is required that clearly states a census or ILR data error, the corrected numbers at that time, and the difference to the published import-export data, and that it relates to where the pupil or student lives, rather than actually funds top-up or currently lives. For not agreed requests, the provider evidence must also show the total data error relates to 3.5 or more pupils or students. And this is due to the threshold at provider level for not agreed changes, which is explained more in the guidance that was issued last week and you may find helpful. And now on to the next slide, where we'll actually look at some examples of evidence. So the first one, here's some good example evidence for an agreed change request. It's actually been based on evidence provided by a local authority last year, but it's obviously been anonymised. So if you do recognise it, a big thank you and well done. As you can see, it's only brief, but in those 2 sentences, it clearly confirms an agreement to the import-export data error and a change of -9 students to the published data, resulting in a total funding change of -54,000 to their DSG. It's also worth noting that the actual underlying request for the local authorities agreement was also very clear and actually included suggested wording for the response, which can be really helpful to recipients. It also means that had a response not been received, this could have been attached and used as evidence for a not agreed change, as the information for the provider was in the preceding email. And now on to the next slide. Unfortunately, this evidence isn't quite such a good example. It was a not agreed change request, and the email shows correspondence with the provider. Whilst it was to the correct provider and the potential error would appear to be above the threshold, it wouldn't be clear to the provider what's actually needed. It doesn't refer to the ILR R06 data at any point or ask for the correct ILR data at that time or a breakdown by the local authorities where the students live. It's also unclear what the correct total data should be, as it only actually refers to last year's data and the plan commissioning. Although it mentions the import-export adjustment, it is a local authority adjustment, and it's worth bearing in mind it doesn't always need to be referred to in the correspondence with providers. It can actually sometimes confuse them, and it's sometimes easier to simply refer to their census or ILR data that you've received, explaining that you think there's been an error, which can have funding implications for your local authority, and ask for the corrected data at the time of the ILR or census. And there are some examples of provider evidence in the guidance issued last week. And on to the next slide. Again, unfortunately, not a great example, the local authority evidence in the not agreed change request, and one that we were therefore unable to approve. The local authority here hadn't received a reply, although you'll note that the email was only sent shortly before the final deadline, so no evidence of the communication before the 4th of July. There's also no reference to the import-export adjustment here or potential funding implications. In fact, the heading actually suggests it relates to the high needs places rather than the import-export, which can be misleading for the recipient local authority. It's also worth noting that the change here only relates to one student, and it was the only change that was requested for that particular college. So it was below the provider level threshold for not agreed changes. And on to the next slide and the next stage. So, as I've said, on to the next stage. So once you have all the evidence and know whether a change is agreed with the local authority, whether it's a not agreed change, or where DFE is the provider local authority, it's then on to completing the template. And these must be returned by the 18th of July. And the next slide. So the first sheet in the template is the summary sheet. On here, simply select your local authority name from the drop-down list and complete your contact details. These are the cells in red marked as requiring completion. The blue cells are automatically populated in here, and the yellow cells are optional. And then on to the agreed change sheet. So this is for those changes where you have evidence of agreement to the change from the relevant local authority. So in this example here, my local authority has agreed a total change with Emmerdale local authority that actually relates to 2 providers. So column A, you select the other local authority's name from the drop-down list. And at column C, you'll enter the pupil number change to the imports data. So this shows the change for a college that's in my local authority area, which had 20 more students attending that lived in Emmerdale of the other local authority. Hence the imports show plus 20. And this will actually be a positive funding adjustment. In column D, these are the change to the exports data. So this shows the change for a special school that's in Emmerdale or the other local authority area, which had 5 more pupils attending that lived in my local authority. Hence the export show plus 5, although this will actually be a negative funding adjustment. So the net pupil change at column E is automatically calculated, and this shows 15. So it's the 20 imports less the 5 exports. This is then multiplied by £6,000 at column F for the funding change amount. The required local authority evidence obviously then needs to be attached. And there is an add-in attachment sheets in the template that explains how to do this. And on to the next slide. So the not agreed change is for those requests where the local authority hasn't clearly agreed the change or not responded to a request. So in this case, the error relates to Skye College in my local authority area. So you'll need to enter the provider details at columns A to F shown at the top of this slide, and please ensure that the UKPRN is completed. If you really don't know the UKPRN number, please enter it as 0. Columns H to B at the bottom of the slide. So in this case, the college confirmed that there was an ILR data error and that 36 rather than 30 lived in Coronation Local Authority. So this gives a change of +6 students, and this is entered into the imports column because the college is in my local authority area. And I've then attached the evidence of communication with both the provider and the local authority. If a change relates to 3 or less pupils or students, the provider evidence would need to show that the total census ILR data error relates to more pupils or students and is in line with the provider level threshold, or the request is unlikely to be considered by DfE. Again, information on the threshold and how it's applied to not agreed change requests is available in the guidance on gov.uk. And on to the next slide. So here we have the DfE funded sheet, and this is to be used for all those providers where DfE is the provider local authority. So this will be non-maintained special schools, special post-16 institutions, and there are also 9 colleges funded by DfE, and these are listed in the guidance issued last week. So in this example, the published data showed 5 students were actually living in my local authority attending the SPI. However, the SPI has confirmed that there were only actually 3 at the time of the ILR, and there was an error. Hence, the change is -2, and that's shown in the exports column. This is, however, going to be a positive funding adjustment as it's a reduction in my exports. It's also worth noting here that the provider level threshold mentioned earlier only applies to not agreed changes, so that doesn't apply here to DfE funded changes. And on to the next sheet. So these are the suggested timings. The deadline for submitting templates is the 18th of July. So we have some key dates and suggested timelines in here, and they are also in the guidance. The suggested timings are obviously flexible, but may help as they fit in with the key dates and allow local authorities to engage with others, obtain the evidence and submit templates if necessary. And now on to the next and final slide in this session. So finally, there is more information on the import-export adjustment and this process available on gov.uk to help you if needed. If you do have any questions on this year's process, please send them to our email at hi.needs@education.gov.uk. Thank you so much for joining, and I really do hope this has been helpful. We're now going to stop recording and we'll go on to the Q&A session. Okay.